"Ethan, are you stupid or blind?" The captain's voice cut through the wheelhouse, sharp and dripping with pity. He held up the chart I'd tried to read, my finger on the wrong channel, and the other hands, Dale and Ricky, erupted in harsh, barking laughter. The sound bounced off the scratched plexiglass, each echo a fresh wave of shame that washed over me. Marcus, with his perfect beard and new jacket, saw me as a relic, a slow-witted part of the boat's inventory he'd inherited. I just clenched my fists and went back on deck, the cold main air a welcome sting. Out there, the sea didn't judge. It just was. And a few hours later, it rolled in a fog so thick it swallowed the world, blinding Marcus's precious screens and his arrogance along with it. But nobody imagined what I would do that day. If this phrase made you remember someone, comment with just, "I understand." My name is Ethan. I'm 45 years old, but some days my hands feel like they're 100. They're not pretty hands. The knuckles are swollen. The skin is a roadmap of scars from hooks, lines, and the unforgiving cold of the Atlantic. They've spent more time in salt water than on dry land. The sea, you see, has been my only constant. My father was a fisherman, his father before him. It's in my blood, this rhythm of the tides, this language spoken not in words, but in the color of the sky and the feel of the wind on your face. It's a language I understand. It's the world of men I've never quite figured out, especially men like Captain Marcus. Marcus bought the sea serpent from his father, but he didn't inherit the old man's respect for the ocean or its people. He's a new breed of captain, one who trusts the glowing screens on his console more than the wisdom of a lifetime. To him, I'm just part of the boat's aging inventory, a slow, outdated piece of equipment he has to put up with. He thinks my silence is stupidity, and my way of seeing the world, which is different from his, is a defect. The truth is, letters and numbers have always been a jumble to me, a secret code I could never crack. But I can read the water. I can read the subtle shift in a current, or the meaning in a flock of gulls flying inland. Those are my books, my charts. But to Marcus, if it isn't on a screen, it isn't real. And he never misses a chance to remind me of it. The worst time, the one that still burns behind my eyes when I try to sleep, happened just a few weeks ago. We were in the wheelhouse. It's a cramped space, always smelling of diesel and Marcus's bitter coffee. He was trying to show Dale and Ricky, the two other hands, a new route he'd plotted on his tablet. Then he turned to me, a smirk playing on his lips. He unrolled an old paper chart, a backup we were required to keep. He knew what would happen. "Ethan," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Show the boys our course back to the harbor, the old-fashioned way." He tapped the chart. I felt my throat tighten. All eyes were on me. I could feel Dale and Ricky holding back their laughter. I leaned over, the lines and words on the paper swimming, blurring into an incomprehensible mess. I tried to trace the coastline, my calloused finger trembling slightly as I searched for a landmark I recognized. I finally pointed to what I thought was the channel. Marcus snatched the chart away. He held it up. "Look at this," he boomed, his voice dripping with a mix of pity and disgust. "He's pointing us straight into the shoals off Bald Rock. 45 years old, and he's going to sink us all because he can't read a simple map." Then came the laughter. It wasn't a friendly joke. It was a cruel barking sound that echoed in the small cabin, each burst a physical blow. I felt the blood rush to my face, a hot tide of shame that felt like it was going to boil over. I didn't say a word. I just turned. My fists clenched so tight my fingernails dug into my palms, and walked out onto the deck. The cold main air was a shock, but it was a relief. It felt clean. Out there, the sea didn't judge. It just was. And I stood there, coiling ropes, my hands performing the familiar motions on their own, while my mind replayed that laughter over and over again. It wasn't just the big moments, it was the constant dripping erosion of my dignity. Little things, every single day. He'd watch me tie a bowline, a knot my grandfather taught me, a knot that is held fast in storms that would tear a ship in two, and he'd shake his head. "We don't have time for your arts and crafts, old man," he'd say, tossing a newfangled automatic clip at my feet. "Just use this. It's faster, it's better." He never understood that the knot wasn't just rope, it was a promise. It was reliability. It was something you could trust your life to, unlike his cheap factory-made gadgets. To him, my experience was a liability. My knowledge was a waste of time. I learned to keep my mouth shut, to do my work, and to find my peace in the vast gray emptiness of the ocean. The others, Dale and Ricky, they went along with it. They were younger, with families to feed. They needed the job, so they'd laugh when Marcus laughed and look the other way when his words cut too deep. On that boat, I was utterly alone. Then came that day. It started like any other. A gray sky, a calm sea, the familiar thrum of the engine. Marcus was in a particularly foul mood, complaining about fuel prices and the new regulations. He'd made a couple of digs at me before we'd even cleared the harbor, something about me moving as slow as the tide. I ignored it, like I always did. I focused on my work, on the rhythm of the waves, but around mid-morning, I felt it, a change. It was nothing you could see. It was a feeling in the air. The salt spray felt different, heavier. The usual cry of the gulls following the boat had stopped. There was a sudden, profound silence. The air grew thick, damp, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. It was an old feeling, a warning the sea gives you if you know how to listen. I walked to the wheelhouse door, wiping my hands on a rag. "Captain," I said, keeping my voice even. "We should think about heading in." Marcus didn't even look up from his phone. "And why is that, Ethan? Got a feeling in your bones?" Dale snickered from his corner. "The birds have gone quiet," I said. "And the air, it's heavy. A fog's coming. A bad one." Marcus finally looked up, his eyes filled with annoyance. He swiped his thumb across his screen and held up his phone. "The most advanced marine weather app on the planet says it's clear for the next 6 hours. Now, if you're done with your sea witch routine, go and check the bait wells." He dismissed me with a wave of his hand. He turned to the others. "Can you believe this guy?" But I knew what I felt. The screens and the apps, they read data. They don't have a soul. They can't feel the ocean holding its breath. Nobody listened. Nobody ever listened. But I knew they were wrong. And as I walked back to the stern, I kept scanning the horizon, waiting. Because I knew the sea was about to teach Captain Marcus a lesson he'd never learned from a screen. If you've ever felt this way, just leave in the comments. We understand. It came on faster than a rumor. One moment the horizon was a faint gray line. The next, there was no horizon at all. The world just ended a few feet from the bow. It wasn't just fog, it was a wall of white. A thick, wet, silent beast that swallowed the boat whole. The sound of the engine seemed muffled. The cries of the gulls were gone, and the only other noise was the gentle rhythmic slap of water against the hull. The air, which had been cold, was now a different kind of cold. It was a heavy, soaking chill that seeped through my jacket and into my bones, carrying the raw, ancient smell of the deep ocean. I could taste the salt on my lips, thick and briny. Inside the wheelhouse, a different kind of silence had fallen. The easy banter, the laughter from earlier, was dead. All I could hear was the frantic, useless beeping of the electronics. Marcus was glued to his console, his face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the screens. His knuckles were white where he gripped the helm. "Come on, you piece of junk," he muttered, stabbing a finger at the GPS display. "Get a lock." "Get a lock." Dale and Ricky stood behind him, their faces pale, their eyes wide and darting from the blank screens to the impenetrable white outside. Panic has a smell, you know. It's a sharp, sour scent, like old sweat and fear. It was thick in that little cabin, thicker than the fog. Then it happened. A flicker, a sharp pop like a firecracker, followed by the smell of burnt plastic, and the screens went black. All of them. The GPS, the radar, the depth sounder. Everything. The sudden total darkness of the console was more terrifying than the whiteout outside. In that moment, Marcus wasn't a captain. He was just a man in a new jacket, staring at a dead piece of equipment, completely and utterly blind. The only light was the weak gray daylight filtering through the plexiglass. The only sound left was the steady thrum of the diesel engine, a heartbeat in the void, and the distant mournful clang of a bell buoy we couldn't see. He slammed his fist on the dashboard, a hollow, defeated sound. "Nothing," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I've got nothing." I stood on the deck, my hands resting on the cold, wet railing. I didn't need to be in the wheelhouse. The real instruments were all out here. I closed my eyes. I let the sting of the fog on my skin tell me the direction of the wind, a faint but steady push from the northeast. I listened, not with my ears exactly, but with my whole body. I could feel the subtle shift of the current beneath the hull, a slow, powerful pull trying to drag us south, toward the shoals. I focused on the sound of the waves. To Marcus, it was just noise. To me, it was a language. I could hear the specific way the water broke against the submerged ledges of the Porcupine Islands off to our port side. A low, gurgling sigh that was different from the sharper slap of open water. I could smell it too. A faint, almost ghostly scent of pine resin carried on the breeze, a message from the shore we couldn't see. My whole life, men like Marcus had judged me for the things I couldn't do. They never once asked about the things I could. My hands were trembling, but not from the cold. It was the fear of being wrong, the crushing weight of their lives resting on a feeling, a sound, a smell. But underneath the fear was something else, a deep, quiet certainty. This was my chart. This was my map. I took a deep breath of the salty air, opened my eyes, and walked to the wheelhouse door. They all looked at me as I filled the doorway, their faces a mixture of fear and desperation. "Turn us 30 degrees to port, Marcus," I said. My voice was quiet, but in that tense, silent cabin, it sounded like a cannon shot. Marcus stared at me, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate confusion. "What? Based on what? Your gut?" The old mockery tried to surface, but it was weak, like a dying ember. "Based on the sound of the bell at the Egg Rock Lighthouse," I said, my voice steady. "It's fainter than it should be, and the echo is wrong. The currents pulled us further south than you think. We're headed for the shoal off Bald Rock, the very place he'd accused me of sending us just hours before. The irony was as thick as the fog." He looked from my face to his blank, useless screens, then back again. Dale and Ricky were staring at me, their mouths slightly open. For the first time since I'd set foot on this boat, no one was laughing. With nothing left to lose, with his whole world of technology and data erased, he slowly, hesitantly, turned the wheel. That's when everything changed, and no one ever looked at me the same way again. "Would you have done the same? Seriously, just answer with yes or no so I know you're here." The world shrank to the four walls of that wheelhouse. Time seemed to stretch and slow down. The gentle thrum of the engine was the only thing that felt real. Marcus's hand hovered over the wheel, his gaze locked on my face. In his eyes I saw a war being fought. A war between the lifetime of arrogance that told him I was a fool, and the cold, terrifying reality that his world of screens and numbers had vanished, leaving him utterly lost. Dale and Ricky weren't looking at Marcus anymore. They were looking at me, their expressions stripped bare of the morning's mockery. They just looked scared and hopeful. It was a look I'd never seen from them before. Finally, with a slow, defeated exhale, Marcus's hand gripped the wheel. His knuckles were bone white. He turned it, the movement stiff and reluctant, like a man signing a confession. The bow of the sea serpent swung slowly to port, pushing into the thick white unknown. The moment he surrendered the helm to my words, the power on that boat shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was as quiet and as absolute as the fog itself. For the next hour, I didn't just work on that boat. I was its eyes. I was its compass. I was its captain. I stood in the doorway of the wheelhouse, one hand resting on the frame to feel the vibration of the hull. I closed my eyes again, shutting out the useless visual of the fog and opening up everything else. "Steady as she goes," I said, my voice calm. I was listening for the echo, the sound of our own engine, bouncing off things hidden in the white. An open expanse sounds different from a channel bordered by submerged rock. The water itself speaks. I could hear the change in its voice as we moved away from the deeper channel and into the shallower approach to the harbor. It was a subtle shift in pitch, a slightly higher, more nervous gurgle against the hull. 10 degrees to starboard now," I commanded. "We need to avoid the shoal off Bald Rock." The name hung in the air between us, the very place Marcus had accused me of steering us toward in his little morning performance. I didn't say it with any malice. It was just a fact, a landmark on my map. I saw Marcus flinch, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He didn't look at me, he just obeyed, his eyes fixed on the empty space ahead of the bow. I could see the shame burning on the back of his neck. Dale took a half step back, away from the captain's chair, as if putting a physical distance between himself and his former allegiance. Ricky just stared at his own boots, his face pale. The silence was their apology. It was the only one I needed. I guided us on a zigzag course, a path that would look insane on a chart but made perfect sense in my head. I was navigating by sound and memory. "You hear that?" I asked, my voice low. They all strained to listen. That low hum, it's the resonance from the underwater cables that run to the island. We need to stay to the east of it. They just nodded, their faces blank with a mixture of fear and dawning wonder. I was reading a language they didn't even know existed. Every command I gave was a piece of a puzzle they couldn't see. A little more throttle, I'd say. I can feel the tide trying to pull our stern around. And Marcus, the man who relied on digital thrust vectoring, would nudge the throttle forward, his movements now fluid, responsive. He had stopped fighting it. He was just the hands, and I was the head. The air began to change again. The raw, open ocean smell of salt was being replaced by something else. Something thicker, more familiar. The low-tide smell of mud and seaweed and creosote from the pier pilings. It was faint, but it was there. My heart started beating a little faster. We were close. The mournful clang of the Egg Rock bell was gone, replaced by a new sound, a rhythmic, gentle sloshing. "Cut the engine," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Marcus pulled the throttle back immediately. The deep rumble of the diesel died, and a profound silence fell over us. In that quiet, we all heard it. The gentle, unmistakable sound of water lapping against wood. Not the hull of a boat, but something stationary, something solid. A shape began to materialize out of the white mist, not as a sudden appearance, but as a slow darkening of the gray. It was like a photograph developing in a darkroom. First a vague vertical line, then another. Then the thick, cross-beamed shape of the main pier at Bar Harbor. It was right in front of us, maybe 50 feet off the bow. We had come through the needle's eye in total blindness and arrived perfectly. No one spoke. Dale let out a long, shuddering breath he must have been holding for the last hour. Ricky leaned against the bulkhead, wiping a hand over his face. They were breathing in the familiar air of home, saved from a fate they couldn't have imagined and couldn't have escaped on their own. Marcus just stood at the dead console, his hands limp at his sides. He stared at the dock as if it were a ghost, a miracle conjured from my words. The fog was already starting to thin, swirling around the pilings, revealing more of the harbor we knew so well. He finally turned to me, his face completely stripped of its earlier pride and mockery. All that was left was a raw, hollowed-out confusion. The question in his eyes was one I had waited a lifetime for someone to ask, not with pity, but with respect. "How?" he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. I didn't look at him. I looked past him, at the harbor I had memorized with my heart, the only map that had ever made sense to me, the lines and depths carved into my soul by decades of wind and water. Some maps aren't on paper, Captain. If you've ever proven something to someone in silence, comment, they understood too late. Tying up at the pier was a silent affair. The usual shouts and clatter were replaced by a strange, heavy quiet. Each man moved with a purpose I hadn't seen before, their motions deliberate, almost reverent. The fog was breaking up, swirling away in lazy gray tendrils, revealing the familiar weathered faces of the buildings along the waterfront. It was like waking from a dream. Dale threw the stern line, his throw perfect, practiced, but his eyes kept flicking back to me, as if he was seeing me for the first time. Ricky secured the bowline, his movements quick and efficient, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stared at the knot he was tying, his face a mask of thoughts he couldn't speak. Marcus was the last one to move. He just stood in the wheelhouse for a long moment, his hands resting on the dead console, a king surveying a fallen kingdom. When he finally stepped out onto the deck, the sun broke through the last of the fog, casting long shadows across the wet wood. He walked past me so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath, and he stopped. He didn't turn to face me. He just stood there looking at the town, his back to me. "Good work, Ethan," he said. The words were quiet, almost swallowed by the cry of a lone gull overhead. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't praise. It was just a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a man who had just been forced to learn a language he never knew existed. And then he walked off the boat and down the pier without another word. Things were never the same after that day. The laughter stopped, the little digs, the condescending remarks about my arts and crafts knots, they all just vanished. The silence on the boat changed. It was no longer the lonely, isolating silence of being an outcast. It became a silence of respect. Dale would bring me a coffee in the morning without me having to ask, and he'd just nod, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. Ricky started asking me questions, not about charts or numbers, but about the sea. "Ethan, does that cloud formation mean anything to you? Or why do the waves sound different today?" He was trying to learn my language. He was starting to listen to the water. Marcus changed the most, though it was in his own stubborn way. He never said the words, "I'm sorry." I don't think he knew how, but his apology came in other ways. A week after the fog, a brand new, top-of-the-line oilskin jacket was hanging on my peg in the cabin. There was no note. No one said anything about it. It was just there. When we'd be in the wheelhouse, he'd unroll the paper chart, not to test me, but to ask me. "What do you see here, Ethan? What's your read on this channel?" He'd look at his screens, then he'd look at me, and he'd weigh them both. He started trusting the man more than the machine. The greatest change was that he started leaving the wheelhouse door open, even in the cold, so he could hear the sounds of the deck, the sounds of the ocean. He was finally learning to listen. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. I just felt settled. Vindicated in a way that had nothing to do with being right and everything to do with being seen. For my entire life, I had felt like a book written in a language no one could read, and for 1 hour, in a world gone blind, someone had finally been forced to learn. The sea is the great equalizer. It doesn't care how much your boat cost or what fancy app you have on your phone. It doesn't care if you can read a stock ticker or a legal document. It's an ancient, powerful thing, and it only respects one currency: knowledge. The real kind. The kind that's earned through a lifetime of listening, of watching, of feeling the world in your bones. Out there, it's not the man who talks the loudest or wears the newest jacket who matters. It's the one who acts when everyone else is frozen. It's the one who can find the path when all the lights go out. That day, the sea didn't just teach Marcus a lesson. It reminded me of one. My worth was never tied to their opinions. It was always there, carved into my hands, written in the currents, waiting for the moment it was needed. The respect they give me now, It feels good, I won't lie. But it also feels fragile, like a piece of sea glass you know the next tide could wash away. It makes me wonder. Do they see me for who I am now? Do they truly understand the map I carry inside me? Or do they just see the man who saved them once? It leaves a question that hangs in the air, thick as that fog. Do they remember me for what I did? Or do they only respect me now because they needed me? Read this ending and comment with one word that summarizes you when they doubted you.